Welcome to the Boss Audits and Investigations. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Scientology Chronicles. I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for the interest in this series, where we go through various government agencies' declassified documents and investigate interviews obtained through FOIA requests. For those that may be interested, seasons 1 and 2 of the Scientology Chronicles is now available as an audio podcast on several podcast platforms such as Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio, and many others. I want to also thank all of the new listeners that have found the content through whatever audio podcast platform you use. If you're interested in seeing the actual documents discussed in the audio versions, all the episodes can be found on my YouTube channel at the Boss Audits and Investigations. No matter what platform you listen to the content on, please take a moment and give it a like, a subscribe, share, follow, and please leave a review. And as always, please leave me a comment with your feedback about this episode. This episode and all episodes do come with trigger warnings. A lot of the topics discussed are sensitive subject matters, and your mental health should always be first. So please take care of yourselves, and let's jump right in. Today's document that we're going to be discussing and reviewing is a follow-up interview with Mrs. Elmo H. Troup. And if you guys remember, Mr. Troup was the military veteran that Scientology pretty much kidnapped him. And we already covered the major details of that story in a previous episode. And I came across a follow-up document, and I thought we would discuss that one today. So let's review this follow-up document. Dated November 21st, 1966. On November 10th, 1966, Mr. Merle Ryan, who is assigned to the Office of General Counsel, called Atlanta District and requested the referenced individual be visited to determine if this was the correct address and ascertain the present status of her husband, Mr. Elmo Troup, and what Mrs. Troup's feelings would be regarding her appearance as a government witness in this case. On November 16th, 1966, a visit was made to the above-mentioned individual. Mrs. Troup came to the door and would not open it. She asked who was there. This inspector made an attempt to identify himself, but Mrs. Troup said she was very busy and for me to return at 1:30 p.m. that day. At 1:30 p.m., this inspector again returned to the residence of the individual. Mrs. Troup again refused to open the door, but opened the jalousies on the door and talked through them. Mrs. Troup again said that she was busy and was expecting a long-distance telephone call. This inspector explained to Mrs. Troup the nature of the visit and tried to get the desired information. This inspector asked Mrs. Troup how Mr. Troup was feeling. Mrs. Troup said that Mr. Troup was in England at St. Hill, approximately 1 year. She said that she had received some literature from St. Hill, and until she had read it, she could not answer any questions concerning Mr. Troup. Mrs. Troup was asked by this inspector about Hubbard e-meters. She said until she read the literature she received from England, she could not answer these questions. Mrs. Troup asked this inspector if he could return the next morning at 8 a.m. She explained that she would be free at that time. This inspector agreed to meet with her the next morning at 8 a.m. The above confirmation was relayed via telephone to Supervisor Inspector Alvis Cosby on November 16th of 1966. This inspector again attempted to meet with Mrs. Troup. Mrs. Troup responded to a knock on the door and invited this inspector in. Mrs. Troup was very talkative and answered the questions asked by this inspector. Mrs. Troup was asked what her feelings were concerning the Church of Scientology. She said it should be referred to predicology instead of Scientology. Mrs. Troup said that Ron Hubbard was a smart man, but thought he had gone off the deep end. Mrs. Troup said that when she lived in Arlington, in Mrs. Troup said that when she lived in Arlington, Virginia, she drove Mr. Troup, her husband, to the Scientology meeting almost every day and waited for him in the car. She said that he used 3 pairs of coveralls each day. Mrs. Troup said that on one occasion, the auditor had Mr. Troup to touch the wall with his finger and return. This ordeal was kept up for 5 hours. She further said that Mr. Troup had blood clots, small cans attached to his legs, which caused small burns on the legs. Mrs. Troup said that the above ordeals were part of the processing. Mrs. Troup said that Mr. Troup had given Ron Hubbard, the Washington auditor, $5,000 to process her. However, Mrs. Troup said that she never was processed, and the auditor would have to prove to her that they were better than she, or she would never be processed. Mrs. Troup said that Mr. Troup had visited her in Florida last year and that a young man was with him and kept an eagle eye on him at all times. Therefore, she did not have an opportunity to talk to Mr. Troup concerning any necessary matters. Mrs. Troup said that Mr. Troup gave the Church of Scientology $100,000 last year. She further said that Mr. Troup was a sick man and had gotten no better during his stay at St. Hill. Mrs. Troup said that she felt that Mr. Troup would return to their home when he realized that the Scientology was for the birds. Mrs. Troup said that she would greet Mr. Troup and if nothing had ever happened and try to make a home that she would be proud of. Mrs. Troup assured this inspector that she would be happy to assist the government in any manner that the government felt was necessary. Summary of findings. It was learned that Mr. E. H. Troup resides at Miami, Florida. Mr. Troup is now in England, St. Hill, and has been there for approximately 1 year. According to Mrs. Troup, Mr. Troup gave $100,000 to the Church of Scientology last year. And Mrs. Troup said that she would be happy to help the government in any way that she could. It is the opinion of this inspector that Mrs. Troup would make the government a rather good witness. She appears to be familiar with the whole operation of the Church of Scientology. William Morton, Inspector, Atlanta District. They don't think John McMasters is going to be a very good witness, but yet Mrs. Troup, who really doesn't have a lot of information or details or even how the organization actually operates, and yet they think she will be a good witness for the government. What do you guys think about that? Do you guys see a theme here where maybe some of these inspectors were kind of recommending people who really didn't have a lot to say or a lot against against Scientology? Do you guys feel like that there was some strange thing going on where some of these inspectors were recommending witnesses to the government that really didn't have any information to give them? What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. Remember, no more kids in Scientology. Kids cannot consent. Please spread love and kindness wherever you go, and I will see you on the next one.